So in the SEC this year, everyone can't make the playoffs. See, that sounds like a really obvious statement, but you have to conceptualize what that means. There are going to be multiple, as in more than one. Several probably means more than two, I would think, in the dictionary. Maybe, possibly. That's how I'm going to use it here. Fan bases that have playoff hopes or expectations this year. And a lot of them are going to come up short. And they're going to be supremely disappointed. This is a question that popped into my mind. Who are those teams going to be? Because here are the teams in the SEC that I think have a reasonable or outside chance that might be slim, but is still technically possible of making the playoff. Georgia, Texas, Bama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri. Those are the teams that I think have a really good shot of getting there for various reasons. Texas A&M and Oklahoma, I think, are outside looking in, and Auburn, Florida would be complete and total wild cards. I don't really put them in the mix there. So let's focus on those 8 teams. How many teams is the SEC going to get in the playoff? The maximum, I think, is 5. The minimum, I think, is 3. So let's say the number is 4. Let's say that number is 4. Georgia's going to be one of those teams. Okay, so now we're down to 3. We've got 3 spots for SEC teams left. Texas is the next odds betting favorite, according to our friends at FanDuel, at minus 230. They are the last team that's greater than minus 200, along with Oregon, Georgia, and Ohio State, to make the playoff in the first place. And then you go down the list, and suddenly, let's say Texas makes it, just for the sake of argument here, and Texas has got a challenging schedule, to be sure. If they win that game week 2 at Michigan, Texas's odds of getting to the playoff are pretty darn good. They're pretty darn good, because I think that'll end up being a very quality win. And if they go through 10-2, 11-1, boom, into the playoff, whether or not they win the SEC championship game. An interesting scenario to think about, just as a quick sidebar. What if a team goes 10-2 in the SEC and one of their losses is just okay, and then they lose the SEC championship game and they're 10-3? Yeah, this 12-team playoff is going to generate all sorts of fun debates, as is always the case. But that means between Alabama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri. Oh, no, I didn't forget about you, LSU. I was just playing a little game. I'm just messing around. Relax. Calm down, comment section. So LSU is in the mix. They're not going to be a lock to get there. They have one of the best offensive lines in the SEC, maybe in all of college football, with a couple of first-round caliber tackles, but you got to change a quarterback. You got some turnover at wide receiver from last year's team. I don't know. I'm not saying they can't do it, but do I feel like they're as close to a lock as a Georgia or a Texas? No, not really. So if you're listening to or watching the show and you're a fan of one of these teams, just know there is a distinct possibility that your team's not going to make the playoff this year. And you got to be prepared for that possibility. Now, I don't know at this time whom I would predict to miss the playoff. I don't know if I love LSU or Oklahoma. Oklahoma's schedule, that's a little bit too tough. Texas A&M, year 1, I think that's asking a little bit too much. So then you come down to Missouri, Tennessee, Ole Miss, and Bama, who I would have going for 2 spots, and LSU as well. Only 2. If I'm picking 2 spots there, I'm taking Ole Miss for 1, and I come down on the next 2 to Alabama and Missouri. Spencer, why would you come down to those 2? Missouri has among the most workable schedules in the entire SEC, and Alabama, as I have talked about recently on the show, has this guy as their head coach. His name is Kalen DeBoer. He is exceptionally good at the coaching thing. His career coaching record at various levels is about 10 wins for every 1 loss. And he's at Alabama now. This is going to be probably the worst Alabama team. Look at the way he's recruiting. Pretty darn good, especially for a guy who had recruiting questions, which I think were fair. He's answering them right now. This is going to be the worst Alabama team, and they still might wind up in the playoff. They still might end up getting there. Getting to the SEC championship game for one of these teams could be exceedingly difficult. Exceedingly difficult. Because you could have tiebreakers, you could have same right. If you told me all those teams go 10-2, yeah. Or if they're in that sort of range, yeah, I could absolutely see it. But does a 9-3 SEC team get in? Think about Oklahoma for a moment. They have games against Ole Miss on the road, LSU on the road. We're not done with the road games yet. They've got to go at Auburn. They've got to play Tennessee, and they've got to play Alabama. And oh, by the way, they have to play Texas. If they go 500 in those games, which I don't think they will, if they go 500 in those games, they're 3-3. Is that getting into the playoff? What does that 9-3 Oklahoma team with that resume look like? Let's say they have a win against Texas and Tennessee and LSU, but they lose to Ole Miss, Alabama, and Auburn. Let's say that's how their schedule shakes out. What do you do? What do you do with that team? This is the conundrum that the committee is going to find themselves in. Before, it was far more clear cut. You could go on number of losses, and strength of record matters, but now it matters even more. And this is just a gauntlet of teams. SEC, best conference in college football, no arguments here. If you make that case, I'm going to stand right behind you and I will support that particular case. But when I look at these teams, you're going to have some really disappointed, upset fan base. Can you imagine? What if Ole Miss doesn't make the playoff? What if Brian Kelly has coached for 3 years at LSU and doesn't have a single playoff appearance? Then what? We'll talk with Caroline Fenton of Locked On LSU later this week about, what that might actually look like there. I think his job is secure the contract as long, and I don't think he's going to just, lose at a high level all of a sudden. But how do things start to feel in Baton Rouge? Does he go on the warm seat for 2025? What about Lane Kiffin? This is going to be the most hyped season of Ole Miss football this year. They are a favorite. Do you know how many teams are a favorite, as in minus odds, to make the playoff? Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame, Penn State, Ole Miss, Michigan. Michigan? How about that? That's not one that I would pick. But 8 teams, 8 schools that FanDuel says, you have minus odds to make the playoff. No, I think Alabama is undervalued in that group. But this is going to be one of the most fascinating components of the SEC season. And yeah, they could get a 5th team into that playoff. You'd still wind up with coaches who have to answer big questions, with fans who are going to look around and go, what on earth is happening here? How did we not get into the 12-team playoff? They expanded the field. It's easier to get there. How did we not get in? I will again read you this list. Georgia, Texas, Bama, LSU, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas A&M, and Oklahoma. I think 5 is the max, but 4 is probably the right number. 4 of those teams, only 4, are getting into the college football playoff. Just something to think about. Just something to think of. It's just a little Monday food for thought. That's all that is. Some Monday food for thought about how the SEC is going to play out, because it's going to be utterly fascinating to see who misses the playoff, how they miss the playoff, and what the reaction is to them missing the playoff. Because before not making the playoff, Kirby Smart missed the playoff last year. Did anybody bat an eye and say it wasn't a good season? No, it wasn't the season they were fully capable of. They were still really, really good. Different standard now, different expectations. It's one of the things that I think is interesting. Not necessarily that I like, but is interesting about the 12-team playoff. Something else I find interesting. USC had been cooking on the recruiting trail. Well, that momentum might have slowed a little bit. And did you see what Memphis did? Memphis? Yeah, we got to talk about those 2 things on the trail coming up next.